For centuries, the Hittites were a mystery. Once lost to history, they seemed more like a biblical myth than a real empire. Then, in the early 20th century, archaeologists stumbled upon ancient clay tablets buried in the ruins of Hattusa, uncovering a forgotten civilization that rivaled Egypt and Babylon. The Hittites weren't just real, they were powerful, advanced, and deeply influential. But one question remained unanswered. Where did they come from? Now, thanks to breakthroughs in ancient DNA analysis, scientists are beginning to unravel that mystery. And the results? Nothing short of astonishing. For decades, historians speculated about their origins. Were they from Anatolia, the Caucasus, or even further east? Traditional archaeology offered clues, but DNA tells a different, clearer story. A story written not in stone or script, but in the cells of ancient bones. In recent years, researchers have extracted and sequenced DNA from Hittite-era remains found in central Turkey. What they discovered not only challenged old theories, but also painted a vivid picture of migration, mixing, and identity in the ancient world. The Hittites were not a single, isolated people. They were a fusion of local Anatolian populations and migrating groups from the steppes and beyond, early Indo-European speakers whose movements reshaped prehistoric Eurasia. This video will dive deep into the surprising genetic roots of the Hittites, exploring who they were, how they came to rule, and what modern science tells us about their legacy. It's a tale of mystery, movement, and the enduring threads of human connection, woven across time and rediscovered through the lens of ancient DNA. So, who were the Hittites really? And what can their genes tell us that their monuments could not? Let's begin. The story of the Hittites begins in the rugged heart of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, long before they carved out a powerful empire. Around 2000 BCE, small kingdoms and city-states dotted the central Anatolian plateau. Among these, a group of people emerged with a distinct language, customs, and a knack for both war and diplomacy. They would eventually become the Hittites. We often think of ancient empires like Egypt and Mesopotamia as the sole centers of early civilization, but the Hittites rose independently and remarkably. Their early history is a mix of myth, archaeology, and now, genetic discovery. Initially known only through mentions in Egyptian and biblical texts, the Hittites remained mysterious until the early 20th century, when excavations at Hattusa, near modern Bogazkale, revealed their sprawling capital, complete with walls, temples, archives, and royal inscriptions. Their ascent wasn't immediate. Around 1650 BCE, King Hattusa began consolidating smaller kingdoms under one banner. His campaigns laid the groundwork for an empire that would eventually challenge the might of Egypt and Assyria. The Hittites weren't just warriors, they were also skilled administrators, builders, and lawgivers. Their legal codes were ahead of their time, placing limits on punishment and offering surprising rights to women. But what really set the Hittites apart was their ability to absorb and integrate. They inherited writing systems from the Mesopotamians, adopted gods from the Hurrians, and traded ideas across cultural lines. This openness likely reflected the diversity of their population, a fact now backed up by genetics. The Hittite language, one of the earliest Indo-European tongues ever recorded, offers another clue to their identity. Written in cuneiform on thousands of clay tablets, it links the Hittites to broader language movements across Eurasia. Linguists long suspected that these connections hinted at migration from the Eurasian steppe. Until recently, that was just an educated guess. Today, DNA from burial sites across ancient Anatolia confirms a mix of local and foreign ancestry. The early Hittites likely emerged through a fusion of indigenous Anatolian farmers and incoming Indo-European speaking groups, possibly related to the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This genetic mixture gave rise to a population uniquely suited to rule a diverse empire. At its height around 1300 BCE, the Hittite Empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to northern Syria. They fought the legendary Battle of Kadesh against Egypt and signed what's considered the world's first known peace treaty with Pharaoh Ramses II. But their success was short-lived. By 1200 BCE, during the Great Bronze Age collapse, the empire fell, its cities abandoned, its legacy forgotten for centuries. Still, the rise of the Hittites marks one of the most fascinating chapters in ancient history. They were not just conquerors, but connectors, bridging cultures, languages, and bloodlines. And as we'll see next, their DNA carries those connections forward, offering new insight into who they really were. For decades, the story of the Hittites was told through crumbling walls, stone inscriptions, and forgotten texts. But in recent years, a new kind of discovery has transformed our understanding, one that doesn't come from artifacts, but from the people themselves. Ancient DNA, extracted from human remains buried in Hittite lands, especially around their capital Hattusa, has opened a new chapter in the history of this enigmatic empire. Hattusa, the ancient capital, is now one of the most important archaeological sites in the Near East. Here, in the heart of modern-day Turkey, scientists uncovered not only temples and royal archives, but also burial grounds that held clues no inscription ever could: the biological legacy of the Hittite people. In carefully controlled lab environments, researchers managed to recover and sequence the genomes of individuals who lived and died in Hittite territory over 3,000 years ago. What they found was stunning. The genetic data showed that the Hittites were not a homogeneous group. Instead, they represented a mosaic of ancestries, proof of centuries of migration, interaction, and cultural exchange. Genetically, these individuals showed continuity with earlier Anatolian farming populations, but also traces of steppe ancestry, associated with Indo-European-speaking pastoralists who had swept into Europe and Western Asia during the 3rd millennium BCE. This genetic cocktail confirmed what linguists had long suspected. The Hittites were likely a branch of Indo-European migrants who merged with local populations in Anatolia. But what makes the Hattusa DNA particularly interesting is how balanced the mixture is. The steppe component wasn't dominant, it was present, but subtle. This indicates a gradual blending rather than a sudden invasion or elite replacement. Moreover, the genetic diversity suggests the Hittite Empire was a cultural melting pot, not just in theory, but in biological reality. Many of the individuals sampled showed genetic links not only to steppe and Anatolian populations, but also to neighboring regions like the Caucasus and the Levant. This aligns with historical records that describe the Hittite Empire as a multi-ethnic state, where foreigners served in royal courts, traded in cities, and even rose to positions of power. One particularly fascinating detail was the apparent absence of foreign elite burials. Unlike other ancient cultures where invading elites left a clear genetic stamp, the Hittites seemed to have integrated newcomers without losing their local roots. This challenges old narratives of violent conquest and paints a picture of a more complex, negotiated process of identity building. The success of this research marks a turning point in Hittite studies. For the first time, the people of this ancient empire are no longer just names in stone. They are genomes, family trees, and ancestral links that stretch into the present. And while there is still much more to uncover, one thing is now clear. DNA doesn't just tell us who the Hittites were. It shows us how they became. One of the most intriguing revelations from genetic studies on the Hittites is the faint but undeniable signal from the Eurasian steppe. For years, scholars debated the origins of the Hittites' Indo-European language. How did an Indo-European tongue arrive in Anatolia, far from the steppes of southern Russia and Ukraine, where the Proto-Indo-European language is believed to have first developed? The answer, as it turns out, may lie deep in the DNA of the Hittites themselves. The steppe connection, though subtle, is critical. Genetic evidence shows that a component of steppe ancestry entered Anatolia sometime during the late 3rd millennium BCE, around the same time that Indo-European languages were spreading across Europe and Asia. This doesn't necessarily mean the Hittites came riding in as conquerors. Rather, it suggests a slow, complex migration of people, ideas, and genes into central Anatolia, long before the rise of the Hittite Empire. But the story doesn't end with the steppes. Alongside traces of steppe DNA, Hittite genomes also carry markers from the Caucasus and northern Mesopotamia, hinting at even deeper layers of ancestry. This points to long-standing interactions across the region, trade, intermarriage, and population movement that predate the empire by centuries. The Hittites didn't just appear in Anatolia. They emerged from centuries of cultural blending and migration, shaped by forces to the east as much as those within. The linguistic side of this puzzle offers further support. The Hittite language, the oldest known Indo-European language preserved in writing, shows archaisms, ancient features lost in later branches of the language family. This suggests that the ancestors of the Hittites may have split off from other Indo-European groups relatively early, possibly during the initial waves of steppe expansion. From there, they moved southward and settled in Anatolia, merging with local populations while retaining parts of their linguistic identity. Interestingly, what sets the Hittites apart is not just their language, but their openness to foreign influence. Unlike some other Indo-European groups, who often maintained linguistic and cultural barriers, the Hittites incorporated elements from their neighbors with remarkable ease. Their cuneiform tablets contain words and names from Hurrian, Hattic, and even Akkadian. Their art and religion absorbed motifs from the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Caucasus. Genetically and culturally, they were as much Anatolian as they were Indo-European. All this reshapes how we think about ancient migrations. The idea of a single dominant Indo-European wave sweeping across the continent is giving way to a more nuanced view, one where people moved in many directions, at different times, often intermarrying and mixing with locals. In this context, the Hittites were not an anomaly. They were a product of a larger interconnected world where East met West, and identities were constantly evolving. So, when we talk about the Hittites today, we're not just talking about an ancient kingdom. We're talking about a bridge between steppe and Anatolia, between Indo-European roots and local innovation, between isolation and integration. Their DNA speaks not of purity, but of convergence. The Hittite Empire didn't rise in a vacuum. It grew, thrived, and eventually fell in a region teeming with other powerful civilizations. From the Mesopotamian giants like Babylon and Assyria to the enigmatic Hurrians and fierce Egyptians, the Hittites existed in constant contact, and often conflict, with neighbors whose cultures were as rich and complex as their own. But this wasn't just about military showdowns. It was also about trade, diplomacy, marriage, and cultural borrowing. And now, genetics is helping us see how deep those connections ran. One of the clearest markers of this interaction comes from the Hittites' relationship with the Hurrians, a people of northern Mesopotamia and the Levant. While distinct linguistically and culturally, Hurrians were closely integrated into Hittite society. Some of the Hittite royal family bore Hurrian names, and Hurrian deities were adopted into the Hittite pantheon. Genetically, this cultural closeness likely had a biological counterpart, intermarriage and shared ancestry between Hurrians and Hittites. Recent studies hint that DNA from the regions traditionally associated with the Hurrians appears in Hittite remains, especially in their southern and eastern territories. Then there's the long-standing rivalry with Egypt. The Hittites and Egyptians fought one of history's most famous battles, the Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 BCE. But this bloody conflict eventually gave way to diplomacy. In fact, the world's oldest known peace treaty, signed between Hattusa III of the Hittites and Ramses II of Egypt, is a testament to the complex nature of their relationship. And just as armies crossed borders, so too did genes. Some genetic markers found in Hittite remains show affinities with Levantine populations, suggesting not just trade and politics, but the movement of people across borders. Meanwhile, interactions with the Assyrians and Babylonians brought new religious ideas, technologies, and administrative practices. Cuneiform writing, borrowed from the Mesopotamian world, became the Hittite standard, even though their language was different. This cultural borrowing is also reflected in their gene pool, with Mesopotamian signals detectable in Anatolian samples, especially from urban centers. Trade, too, played a crucial role in shaping the genetic landscape. The Hittite Empire controlled important routes that connected the Aegean to Mesopotamia. Merchants, craftsmen, and even slaves moved along these paths, bringing their customs and their DNA with them. Archaeological remains from sites like Hattusa contain evidence of foreign goods and exotic materials, but also individuals who may have originated far from Anatolia. All these threads point to a vital truth. The Hittite world was porous, not closed. Borders were crossed often, not just by soldiers and kings, but by ordinary people whose journeys and unions shaped the genetic fabric of the empire. The Hittites were part of a dynamic network of civilizations, exchanging far more than goods and words. They exchanged bloodlines, traditions, and ideas, creating a hybrid identity that defies simple labels. In the end, it's this blend, this constant push and pull between difference and integration, that defined the Hittite Empire. And it's this same blend that we now trace in their ancient DNA. For centuries, the Hittites seemed to vanish after the fall of their empire around 1200 BCE, swallowed by the tides of time and the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations. Their cities crumbled, their language disappeared, and even their name was nearly forgotten outside of biblical references. But today, through the lens of genetics, we are discovering that while their empire faded, the Hittites themselves did not vanish. They became part of the DNA story of modern populations, particularly those in and around central Anatolia. Recent ancient DNA studies from Hittite burial sites in central Turkey have provided a snapshot of who these people were at the genetic level. These genomes are now being compared with those of modern populations across the region, and the findings are both fascinating and humbling. The genetic markers typical of the Hittite era inhabitants show a strong continuity with people living in modern-day Turkey. Particularly in the central and eastern Anatolian regions, local populations carry a significant portion of ancestry that can be traced back to the Bronze Age, including the time of the Hittite Empire. What's even more interesting is that while later waves of migration, such as those from Central Asia during the Seljuk and Ottoman periods, added new layers to the Anatolian gene pool, they didn't erase the older ones. The Hittite genetic legacy persisted through the centuries, often blended with later influences but never fully lost. This continuity tells us that the collapse of a civilization doesn't necessarily mean the disappearance of its people. In many cases, they simply adapt, assimilate, and continue on in new forms. Furthermore, the genetic influence of the Hittites might not be limited to Turkey alone. Some genetic traces stretch into neighboring regions like northern Syria, the Caucasus, and even southeastern Europe. This suggests that as the empire broke apart, some Hittite-descended populations may have migrated or mixed with other groups, leaving behind genetic footprints that still exist today. Language, of course, did not survive in the same way. Hittite, the oldest known Indo-European written language, disappeared and left no direct modern descendant. Yet its speakers, those who lived, worked, and raised families in Hattusa and other cities, passed on more than words. They passed on their biology, which still circulates in the blood of people living in these lands today. The modern legacy of the Hittites is, therefore, not one of absence, but of presence. They live on in the genes of shepherds, farmers, engineers, and school teachers across Anatolia. They are part of the story of modern Turkey and the broader region, silently carried forward by descendants who may not even realize how ancient their roots truly are. Through DNA, the Hittites have come back into focus, not just as historical actors, but as ancestors. Their legacy isn't buried in ruins or lost in ancient tablets. It's alive, written in the genetic code of modern people, quietly enduring across millennia. The story of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, has often been told through the lens of conquest by the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Turks. But long before these powers rose and fell, the Hittites built one of the world's earliest empires in this same land. Now, thanks to advances in genetic science, the Hittites are emerging not just as an ancient curiosity, but as a foundational part of Anatolia's human landscape. Their DNA is rewriting what we thought we knew about the deep roots of this complex region. When archaeologists first uncovered Hittite ruins in the 19th century, it was a revelation. Here was a powerful civilization with written laws, diplomatic treaties, and monumental architecture. yet forgotten by history. But even then, questions lingered. Where did they come from? Who were they related to? And where did they go after their empire collapsed? For years, these questions remained unanswered. Today, ancient DNA extracted from Hittite era remains is transforming our view of Anatolia's past. The findings reveal that the Hittites were not outsiders or recent migrants. Instead, they were deeply embedded in the local genetic fabric. Their DNA contains significant continuity with earlier Anatolian Neolithic farmers, showing that they evolved culturally and genetically in place rather than arriving suddenly from afar. But there's more. While their genetic roots were largely local, the Hittites also carried traces of ancestry connected to steppe populations, likely linked to early Indo-European movements. This supports the linguistic evidence that their language, though unique, belonged to the Indo-European family. It paints a picture of Anatolia as a crossroads, not just of trade and culture, but of people and genes long before the classical era. This genetic insight shifts our understanding of what it meant to be Hittite. It wasn't about racial or ethnic purity, nor a single tribal origin. It was about cultural fusion, adaptation, and long-term residence in one of the most strategically important regions of the ancient world. Anatolia, it turns out, wasn't a stage on which outside empires performed. It was a deeply rooted homeland with its own rich, evolving populations. The implications go even further. This new genetic narrative helps reframe modern identities. Many people living in Anatolia today, regardless of language, religion, or national borders, share a biological link with ancient populations like the Hittites. That doesn't mean modern identities are simple reflections of ancient ones. But it does show that our histories are often more interconnected and continuous than we realize. Finally, Hittite DNA reminds us how much we still have to learn. Every bone unearthed and genome sequenced is a thread that connects us to a broader human story, one that is not confined by the borders of modern nations or the limits of written history. In redefining ancient Anatolia, Hittite DNA brings the past into sharper focus and reminds us that even the most powerful empires leave their truest legacy not in stone, but in people. As technology continues to evolve, the study of ancient DNA is becoming one of the most powerful tools in uncovering lost chapters of human history. The Hittites, once cloaked in mystery and myth, are now stepping into the light through the precision of genome sequencing. Yet, this is only the beginning. So far, most genetic data from the Hittite era comes from limited archaeological samples, concentrated in central Anatolia. As more excavation sites open up, especially in lesser explored regions of the former Hittite Empire, we can expect a richer, more detailed picture of how this ancient population formed, evolved, and interacted with others. Were there regional differences within the Hittite world? Did border populations differ genetically from those in the imperial heartland? These are questions future studies can help answer. Genetics is also reshaping the way people think about heritage and identity. In Turkey and surrounding regions, interest in ancestral roots is growing. The realization that many modern populations may share distant genetic ties to the Hittites could inspire a deeper appreciation for the deep historical layers beneath modern cultures. However, it's important that this information is used thoughtfully. Genetics can reveal connections, but identity is shaped by many things: language, culture, memory, and personal meaning. Crucially, the study of Hittite DNA highlights a shift in the role of science in history. We're no longer limited to interpreting stones and scripts. We can now listen to the biological whispers of the past. The Hittites are no longer silent ruins or names in ancient treaties. They are part of a living story, one that we are still discovering. And as more ancient genomes are decoded, the future of Hittite research promises to be as surprising and enlightening as the past.